Good morning, everyone, and welcome to this webinar on Uncool Brittania. Thank you very much indeed for taking the time to join us this morning. I hope you'll find it time well spent. I suspect that will be the case, having done a fair few events with Rebecca in the past. She's an excellent speaker and knows an awful lot about what's going on in the world at the moment, as we're soon to find out. A couple of things, bits of housekeeping for you to run through to start with. Firstly, I have to point out that neither Rebecca nor I are investment advisors, so we're going to be as open as we possibly can beyond this call. But when Rebecca speaks, she'll be providing you with her own feelings on the economy and the way in which policy is unfolding. But clearly, you should make your own minds about what you do with that information, and that's basically what this slide says. It's also this slide's here so that we can forward out recordings or copies of the webinar recording after the event as well. I'll run through our bios in a second, but in terms of format, the webinar will be about 55 minutes, so we'll make sure it finishes in time for anybody who's got 11 o'clock calls. For the first 40 minutes or so, Rebecca and I will have a sort of Q&A interview type format. And then for the last 15 minutes, again, or so, depending on the volume of questions that we get, we'll open up to a Q&A. As I'm sure you're all used to, please use the Zoom Q&A function if you want to ask any questions, and we'll get through as many of those as possible. And again, I'll temper the amount of time we leave for questions to the amount that we've had come in. In terms of intros, very briefly, my name is Nick Morgan. I've been at Foresight Group for nearly 14 years now, and my job is co-lead of the sales team that we have here, so the intermediary-facing sales team that distributes largely our tax efficient based products, so those VCTs, EISs, and business relief based inheritance tax solutions. So that's my background. Rebecca, your background is far more interesting than mine. So would you mind, I mean, we've got some details up on the screen anyway, but perhaps you could add a little colour to your own biography before we kick things off.
Thank you very much indeed, and it's an absolute privilege to be here. Yeah, I run something called the Centre for Economic Security, and one of the things that we're trying to do is inject into the world a sense of urgency about economic security and why we need to think about the institutions of particularly the post-war Bretton Woods agreements, so things like the World Bank, things like the International Monetary Fund, why those organisations need quite significant reform in order to deal with the economic security challenges that we have. Why have I set up all of this? Because over the course of my history, I've really realised that the interface between defence and economics is a lot closer than people commonly recognise. And I'm one of these people that through my whole career working with the last Labour government as advisor to the Treasury Select Committee, but also as chief economist in a couple of Labour-leaning think tanks, I've actually got some insight into the ways in which this particular government is or isn't thinking. So I think from that point of view, my career has been about innovation, it's been about economic growth, it's been about economic institutions, and obviously a lot of those things now are coming to the surface in terms of a very contested environment. So that's me from an economics and a political risk point of view.
Brilliant, thank you. To start with, I suspect there's a few people on the call who are aware of this, but we ran some events with you in September and early October of 2024, by which time there was a great deal of furore about what would be in the first Labour budget. It was delayed, I think, a couple of months to give Rachel Reeves all the time that she wanted to sort of run her plans via the office for the budgetary office, etc., etc. So we ran some events hypothesizing about what might be included. It turns out that a lot of what you talked about was exactly on point. But perhaps could you give your reflections on the run up to that budget and then the things that you did predict and why you predicted them, but also maybe the things that surprised you in the budget and truthfully what's happened since in terms of the direction that Labour has gone?
Thank you. So yeah, I think at the time I look back over what I said then actually, and it's quite interesting how much of it's actually happened. It's still the case that the government is focused on growth. It's still focused on industrial strategy. It's tipped money into the types of organisations that I predicted it would. So things like National Wealth Fund and UK Export Finance. It's taken a lot of its spending, what's called off balance sheet, into what's called contingent liabilities. In other words, it's guarantees rather than spending. and I said all of this would happen. What I also said was that the government was like rabbits in the headlights. So there was a sense at the time before that budget that the government wanted to be really boring. And it wanted to do stuff that was really quite measured, making markets feel comfortable. And the core thing at that point was not to either look like a tax and spend like traditional Labour government, or to do anything at all to say that the fiscal framework of the economy was going to be altered. So they had to look as though they were completely safe and that the markets could trust the levels of borrowing and so on. So all of that has proven to be the case, except that the Labour Party has shown itself to be, in lots of ways, a tax government, if not a spend government. And we can come on and talk about defence and security spending shortly. But I think one of the problems is that within a Labour government, there is always this tension between welfare spending, helping people, and making sure that costs aren't too high, alongside a sense that if you tax the wealthy, then you're going to alienate people. So there's always this sense of trade-off within a Labour government, and I think we've seen that over the last couple of years, perhaps to an extent that I wasn't expecting it to happen, because the government still is very scared about spending money on defence. It's still very scared about raising debt thresholds. And we all agreed when we were speaking last time around that there was going to be a lot of nervousness around raising debt levels, and that there was this kind of almost paradoxical statement: you needed to raise taxes or you needed to raise debt levels. You couldn't square the circle otherwise. That still remains the case. Okay, so the government still hasn't worked out what its answer to that conundrum is, and it's becoming mission critical for the government. So it's becoming something that the government is actually going to tumble. It's actually going to fall on the back of this. Being boring, doing everything safe, making little micro adjustments. It's done a lot of what it said it would do from a sort of micromanagement point of view. A lot of the things that it said it was going to do, it has done. It's also taxed the wealthy in the way that it said it was going to do. But the problem is that they didn't necessarily see what the unforeseen consequences of that were going to be. That there'd be capital flight, that there would be real pressures on families and so on, that actually made them say, well, we may as well sell up now rather than cope with inheritance tax later. And so it's altered the attitude of people with wealth towards the government. But we've also seen a lot of the constraints around welfare, around healthcare, and so on. They were huge strategic problems that the government had to deal with. And it would have been the same whichever type of government came in. Those strategic problems were massive, needed huge amounts of expenditure. And in order to solve them and make things better for the British public, they needed to be more aggressive, perhaps on talking to markets, saying we've got a long-term economic plan and this is how it's going to work. Unfortunately, markets are nervously believing them at the moment, but don't believe them in terms of the pressure that's on government, and everybody is talking about needing to raise debt, more debt, and having to break the fiscal rules. It means that as we move into this next phase of government, whatever happens, whether it's Keir Starmer or whether it's Andy Burnham or the government limps on in some way, shape or form, the next 3 years are going to be really very difficult for whoever is in power. And this leads into the thing that I really think I did get right last time round. I said that I thought the world was at economic war. I think that might have created a ripple around the room, but a lot of that economic warfare is actually our own capacity to be able to borrow from markets in the West. I think I even underestimated the extent to which governments would stay like rabbits in the headlights in that framework. I would say I underestimated the extent to which they would get blocked on defence. I would say I underestimated the fragility of this bond market and government relationship. I thought they would be boring and sort it out. They've been boring, but they haven't sorted it out. And I have absolutely underestimated the extent to which the relationship between US and Europe would change. I said it was changing, but President Trump, Liberation Day, etc., that has broken the international rules-based order. And while the government itself, and I'm in government a lot, does not like the phrase economic war, when you see it on the front page of the Daily Mail about a month ago, because of what's happening in the Middle East, you realise that actually you might be onto something.
It sounds then, I think, a lack of decisiveness, a timidity in government. That has that surprised you, or did you foresee that? And that I guess is conflicting factions within the Labour Party, meaning Keir's trying to keep everybody happy at the same time, and ultimately keeping nobody happy or nobody particularly happy.
Um, yeah, I mean, actually, I think it's predictable. The extent to which it would become a market failure, and it would actually damage the government, I don't think I did predict. So I think the timidity that we're seeing at the moment is really deeply worrying, because they seem, I mean, I used the phrase rabbits in the headlights. I used that phrase last time we spoke. Rabbits in the headlights now. Keir Starmer is coming out and saying it won't make any difference who comes in and runs this country. We have these bigger pressures that are out there that are beyond simple macroeconomic frameworks. The issue that he has is that he might say that until he's blue in the face, but unless the Treasury come out and say, yes, we've got big economic problems. We have a real economic security problem at the moment because we can't borrow, we can't raise taxes, and we've been very timid. We need a plan to deal with all of this, and it's not just us; it's continental Europe as well. It's the whole of the non-US aligned set of nations. We have a big economic security crisis on our hands. Threats from China, energy price shocks, food price shocks. We're going to see medicines and supply chains become a big issue as well. All of those things culminate in this very real sense that one country by itself cannot solve these problems. It's a collective economic security problem. The government is still sticking within its orthodox economic frameworks. And there's going to come a point where it can't do that anymore, where it has to say, look, this is a national emergency. You've got people like Kemi Badenoch now standing up and saying, we all need to work together. Actually, we do all need to work together, and Kemi will say anything that gives her a little bit of power at the moment. But I mean, it's nevertheless the case that the Labour Party needs to stop being as timid, and it needs a very clear and actually almost warlike narrative around what it's doing. And it'll need that whether Andy Burnham's in power in 3 months' time or whether it's Keir Starmer. So this timidity is because they're scared of markets and they're scared of upsetting their core constituents. The problem is that nobody actually wants that timidity. And actually it's a problem with the whole of the centre ground in politics at the moment. Everything is being flung to the sides because the extreme left and the extreme right have a narrative that the centre ground doesn't have. It doesn't have that narrative. We're going to be reasonable. We're going to try and help everybody. And at the moment, if you look at what's happening in America, you look at China's dominance around the world, you look at how Russia's disrupting everything, you look at the situation in the Middle East, everywhere is driven by extremes at the moment. And the centre ground needs a really clear narrative that takes that into account.
But I guess, I mean, a lot of what you've just said is kind of, well, certainly address some of what I'm about to ask, but there is this dislocation in the UK and clearly much further afield and deviation from around the political and I guess also the economic norm to some extent, although perhaps the economic norm is clinging on for as long as it possibly can, and maybe that's part of the challenge you're talking about. But can you talk a little bit more about why we're seeing this level of chaos that we are in politics? I mean, we're talking now about a five-party nation as opposed to the traditional two-party nation or two and a half, you might argue, over the last 40 or 50 years or even longer.
So I think in terms of what's going on, it is this narrative, which is for the last let's call it 12, 13 years. And it's really been since the rise of a populist narrative in the United States. There's been this fragmentation of traditional centre left or centre right thinking. Um, Now, what's been going on, and this is really something that I think we fail as analysts to sit and realize what the economic consequences are of all of this. But what's been going on is, people in the blue wall constituencies have been going, there's a bunch of people in London, there's a bunch of people in France, there's a bunch of people in China or Vietnam or wherever that are getting more than I get. Somehow or the other, they're doing better than I am. And it creates a sense of haves and have-nots, and that's been the entire anti-globalization movement over the last, ever since the global financial crisis, really. I mean, there's been this kind of fragmentation of the norms and things that we were expecting to be. We all thought that our model in Europe and the United States was what everybody wanted. And it's not. And we began to get this whole fragmentation in the political narrative. Now, what do I do if I'm sitting in a blue wall constituency and I don't know that my job is secure from AI? I don't know that I've got control over the energy prices that I'm paying. I see everyone talking about climate change and we're all going to hell in a handcart, and I doom scroll, and even the stuff I used to watch on television, like Married at First Sight, I now can't trust anything anymore, right? I can't trust anything anymore. So it gives me a sense of alienation from what's going on. And somebody comes along and they say, well, it'd be easier if we're out of the European Union, one. Number two, actually, like the United States, like everywhere around the world, we've got a problem because it's not your fault that you can't get a reliable job, that you're on a 0 hours contract. It's actually because we've got very high levels of immigration. Clear message. Now, what's going to happen is that we're going to make Britain great again. We're going to, just like President Trump's making America great again, we're going to cut back on immigration, and we're going to trade more. I export less, I export more, you export less, I win, you lose. And it's a nationalist rhetoric that gives people a sense of identity. It gives them a sense of purpose, because the centre ground of, oh, everything's going to be fair, and you're all going to be better off and the economy is going to grow. That narrative doesn't work anymore because the economy isn't growing. It's growing a little bit, but one of the things I remember I did say, because I feel like a broken record on this, it doesn't matter whether the economy is growing by 0.6% or shrinking by 0.2%. It makes only a marginal difference to the population. Now, if you start talking about economic security, then everybody goes, oh, I know what that means. And if you start talking about making choices in markets and freedom to make those choices, then everybody knows what you're talking about. You've got a value system. It's something you can believe in. Your freedom to work in markets, that's worth fighting for. Your freedom, your democratic freedoms, your right to vote for reform or restore or whoever. And so it's the issue is this fragmentation of politics around populism and a sense of lack of fairness. And of course, it's all been disseminated through social media. And, I could speculate. Well, I wouldn't be speculating. I know exactly what's happening, but it's we could speculate that maybe it's disinformation and misinformation that has made countries ungovernable, that this has actually been fueled by narratives that aren't ones over which politicians traditionally or mainstream media has a control. And so what it's done is it's fragmented the way in which generations are thinking, the way in which traditional voting patterns are, and it's that that's causing the problem. The centre ground, which I think most people would reasonably say they are, doesn't have a voice anymore.
And I guess it's just not keeping enough people happy, hence the dislocation and the interest. So you find yourselves, well, the country finds itself, and of course, as you've already said, not just this country, in what effectively is a vicious circle, which,
Yes. And the
populism
more the
becomes.
exactly, and the more the mainstream politicians try and solve these problems, the more somebody goes, No, it isn't, and it's all over social media. So, I mean, if I'm Keir Starmer and I actually want to talk about the security threats, and obviously there are security threats out there, and we know that there are security threats out there. If I'm Keir Starmer and I want to say, well, actually, the reason why my glasses were such a political issue when I was first elected, if you remember, there was all that kerfuffle around, and everybody went, "Oh, we can't trust him. He's got a pair of glasses that were paid for by somebody else." Does that sound like a mainstream media story to you, or does it sound like something that's been hyped up on social media? Make your own
Mhm.
decision, but it's to me those little stories are, and I mean, I'm kind of joking about Married at First Sight, but it's the clickbait that are become the things that people care about, and they
Mhm.
care more about their local communities, and they care more about themselves and how they're surviving in this framework. And so while there are people who seem to be getting glasses that are paid for by somebody else, or clothes that are paid for by somebody else, or any whiff of anything, that corrupts the political debate, because that becomes something that's there and it's very easy to disrupt. So yeah, we've got this sort of mainstream media versus social media versus inequality versus end of globalization, and it all coalesces in this populism and sort of economic nationalism that we're seeing everywhere around the world, which means that the United States effectively can declare war on the institutions of the global rules-based order and say they're not for us anymore. China and Russia have already done it. Okay, we have a problem.
And I guess what makes that worse still, and maybe this is my sort of last question on this, but the unfairness of that. Keir Starmer is criticised because somebody bought him a pair of spectacles. Nigel Farage gets a £5 million political donation from a crypto guy in the Far East or whatever it might be. I mean, the level of media coverage that each has had has been significant, but in very different ways in terms of the way it's been opined by people.
Exactly. And so then you ask, well, maybe there are different amounts of money, maybe there are different approaches, maybe one person is saying one set of things because, they believe in their own integrity, and the other person is able that, well, they both believe in their own integrity, resolutely believe in their own integrity. But the language becomes complicated because one is capturing it in a way that is, well, I was rewarded for supporting Brexit, and look at all the glory that that's brought us, and that was a good thing. Whereas
Mm.
Keir Starmer says, look, I've never done anything wrong. So Keir Starmer is on a back foot. And anything that he says, again, to reiterate, if he says we are under misinformation, disinformation threat, and there is asymmetric power in terms of the amount of money behind a lot of these things, and I'm trying very hard not to sound like a conspiracy theorist, but these things are happening. Um, if he says actually don't trust everything you read in newspapers, and then Nigel Farage says
Yeah.
prove it, and everybody goes, see, we told you we couldn't believe anything you said, and he loses the debate even further. So he's absolutely stuck in a communications nightmare where he cannot communicate with his core constituency, which he's always had as traditional Labour voters, because there's no such thing as a traditional Labour voter anymore. It's not done on class grounds, it's done on fairness grounds, and the definition of fairness has changed.
Yeah. So, I mean, an obvious but difficult question for you to answer, but how do we break the cycle? How does the cycle get broken? And I mean, to help is we've seen Mark Carney come to power in Canada. From a long way back in terms of the polls, it was seemingly pretty extraordinary that he did gain power. Does it need that strength of leader? That I mean,
Yes.
he clearly is a fairly well. I suppose there's some personal bias in this, but he seems like a pretty exceptional guy. Is it that kind of tour de force that you need to break the cycle and build
It,
trust again?
it completely is. So what happened in Canada, and Canada is really interesting, and I'll tell you why Canada's interesting in a minute. But what happened in the political narrative in Canada was that Mark Carney said, okay, I'm going to seize the moment because President Trump is creating a visceral sense of hatred in Canada. I am going to harness, and up to the point where President Trump came to power, the Canadians were actually very much on that sort of, we're going to go down the populist route as well, which is why it was so interesting that he managed to turn that over. What Trump did was actually, with the whole 51st state narrative and the whole Arctic Circle narrative, create a sense of tension between Canada and the United States that had always bubbled under the surface. There's always a sort of love to hate you type thing, or hate to love you, whichever way around you want to look at it. But Carney managed to harness it in a, we've got Canadian values. We believe in a free social liberal market economy and democracy, and we're a middle power, but we're going to run this because I'm an ex-banker and an ex-central banker and a good economist, and I'm going to run this in a way that makes it better for Canadians and puts us on the world map, and hence the whole middle power narrative and so on. Now, what's interesting, and this is really interesting, is if I go back to my point about institutions, there is an article in the NATO treaty that nobody ever talks about, and it's called the Canada Clause. And I'm betting that nobody knows what I'm talking about right now, but it's Article 2. Article 2 of the NATO treaty is a collective commitment to free and fair markets, to economic cooperation in times of emergency, but also to economic stability, etc., in order to make sure that the economies are in a position to defend themselves. Article 2, at the moment, the Canada Clause, is the most important article in the NATO treaty, in my view. And I actually had to tell some military generals in NATO, I actually had to say to them, have you ever heard of Article 2? They hadn't. I had to explain to them what it was. So that goes back to, let's have a look at some of our institutions. Let's refocus how we're doing all of this. And it is super interesting, in my view, that Gordon Brown in the UK, who is very much of the Carney school of thought. They've worked together, they know each other very, very well. And they have a very similar view of what the centre ground in politics should be doing. It's very interesting that he has been put in charge of sorting out defence financing in the UK. That's because I think Keir Starmer is not going to be able to break that cycle between the Treasury and Number 10 without the heft of a real intellectual heavyweight like Gordon Brown coming in and doing that for him.
So a shrewd appointment then, in that sense.
Yeah. Oh, I think it's brilliant. I think it's a brilliant move. Keir Starmer's not going to go down easily. This is going to be messy. But by appointing Gordon Brown, it would be very difficult for Andy Burnham or Wes Streeting or whoever to come in and say, right, okay, so we're going to let Gordon Brown go. We don't do that.
And so, I mean, if one of the routes to getting out of the cycle that we're in at the moment is strong leadership, there's no obvious sense to, again, this is personal opinion, I guess, but as to where that's coming from at present. In which case, what does that mean for the UK, do you think, for the next, I guess, we've got 3 years potential term of the current government left. But until we see the emergence of that strong leadership or perceived strong leadership, and maybe that's it. Maybe people perceive that Farage has got that. How do you see things unfolding over the next 2 or 3 years? A horrible question to ask, or a difficult question to ask.
It's a difficult question to ask, and I think anybody who says they know would be a fool, including the government. And if you look at the civil service, it's all over the place. I mean, I work quite a lot with various people in government and do so now. I actually think that this whole issue around defence is going to, and defence spending is going to define the next 3 years. I think there is absolutely no way the government can duck that problem. And I did say I thought defence was going to be a growth market. Now, one of the last time we spoke, but one of the reasons why it's it is a growth market, there has been venture capital investment tip into it, and it's suddenly stalled, is because the UK government has gone, well, yeah, but we haven't got any money for the next 2 years, so we can't spend any money, and we don't want to release a defence investment plan. So what has the government got to do? I think it's actually got to start talking about economic security. It can't talk about economic growth anymore. And I don't think there's an understanding of what's going on in government to be able to do that in a forthright way, unless it is a figure like Gordon Brown, because Gordon Brown's already said these things. Now, Gordon Brown, does he really want to step back into the fray like this? I don't know. I'm not personally connected with Gordon Brown, so I wouldn't know. But he must have come back in because he felt there was a need for, if you like, backdoor leadership around all of this. I think if the government can put together an economic framework that says we understand the nature of the economic security threat that we face, we understand the need for increased government expenditure on defence, but also across our entire critical national infrastructure. So health service, education, transport, water, food, all of these things are part of our economic security threat, part of our economy. And, you know, in the newspaper yesterday, we're at the highest level of foreign purchase of British firms in the last 6 months to 6 to 12 months than we've ever been. So, I mean, we are seeing a huge amount of hollowing out of British infrastructure at a time when everybody else is going, we need to make sure that investment from abroad is cleared on national security grounds, and we need to make sure it's in the interest of buying British, blah, blah, blah. So whatever Rachel Reeves is saying about markets and buying, you know, buying British assets, it's very difficult when you don't actually know that you've got any British assets because it's something that has been hollowed out, and this need to put money into the SME base across the UK, this need to integrate ourselves back into defence and security, but also critical national infrastructure supply chains across Europe. It's a massive problem of industrial policy. One defence investment plan isn't going to solve that problem. So it's all about understanding that core narrative, having a big picture view of what's going on, and therefore turning it into something that markets will tolerate any increased borrowing. Or, and this is something else I talked about, public sector net borrowing, which is investing. So using multilateral structures to use cash for asset swaps. And this is, I mean, you know, you saw from my CV, I am involved with the Defence Security and Resilience Bank, which is a multilateral bank to start creating collective defence finance framework for NATO countries. That's something that you know isn't, you don't have to borrow as such, or it's not treated as borrowing on a balance sheet. It's treated as a cash for asset swap. So there are ways of doing all of this, but the traditional neoclassical economics that has dominated the Treasury over the last 20 years doesn't buy it. So that's the issue that we face. We have to get around that core problem.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to change topic slightly, but one of the things that we sort of advertised that we would talk through is, I'm going to use the same word, dislocation between public market valuations, which are, you know, high. It took an awful long time for the FTSE 100 to bust through 7,900-ish.
Yeah.
It then did that and some, and it's
Yeah.
now sort of hovering around sort of 10.3 to 10.5 trading range at the moment, having been a bit higher than that in times. Why are we seeing such buoyant public market valuations where the experience in the real economy is somewhat different?
So I think this is one of our core problems because we've talked about an AI bubble. And a lot of the asset market valuations are being inflated. I mean, you don't need to be Rebecca Harding to understand this. You just need to look out the window. You know, one of the problems that we have at the moment is we've got AI, which is still, everybody was going at the beginning of the year, is this a bubble that's going to burst? And everybody's like, no, we don't want that bubble to burst. There is a huge amount of unorthodox money that is floating around. Now, so let's use the last 3 months as an example of, or since February the 28th, as an example of how this disconnect between markets and the real economy is actually playing out. So when the US and Iran went to war, the immediate consequence was to shut down the Strait of Hormuz and create that actually huge power for a country like Iran, asymmetric power for a country like Iran, compared to the massive financial and military presence of the United States. What's interesting is that through that period, we've seen treasuries become a little bit more vulnerable, but not exactly how you would have expected it. You would have expected it to be a flight to safety, right? It hasn't been a flight to safety, and that's starting to push up costs. So it's having a real economy effect on cost of mortgages, etc., etc. You've got energy costs going up, and they will stay high. And even though oil prices are coming down sort of significantly below $100 a barrel, even $90 a barrel now, which feels like, oh, thank goodness for that. They're still higher than they were on February the 28th, right? And they will be sticky downwards. And for however long it takes to open up Hormuz, that's still going to be the case. Hormuz will not open quickly. So the insurance costs of Hormuz opening quickly is something that is not going to resolve easily. War insurance at the moment is at a very heavy premium, and the result of that is that there's a lot of shipping that can't move because it can't get insurance at the moment. So it's quite, when they've taken mines out of the strait, they've also then got the insurance problem, and until there is a proper, robust, guaranteed framework where there aren't going to be bombs flying all over the place and they're going to be able to get through the Strait of Hormuz, that issue isn't going to go away. All of this affects the cost of capital. All of this affects the real world in terms of business, and yet markets have not reacted in the way that you would have expected them to. I mean, if you look at equities over the last 3 months, yes, they've gone up and down a little bit, but they have mostly gone up. And most people who have money in equities will have gone, well, I just sat tight, and actually I've made a decent amount of money out of all of this. So the reason why is because money is not behaving in the same way. All markets are worried about, and I did talk about this last time as well, all markets are worried about is interest rates. And the only thing, and they're sticking in their real sort of free markets, rational market theory guardrails at the moment to say all that matters is whether or not the Fed puts up or down interest rates. And so long as it keeps it stable or only hikes once or twice, then we're not worried. And that's it. All the AI stuff, it's fluff. Or I mean, it's not fluff, but it's creating a bubble. But as long as interest rates stay how they are, that's all markets are worried about at the moment. But you've also got to remember, a huge amount of money is not in formal markets. It's now in stablecoin, it's now in crypto, it's now in Bitcoin. And you've got this battle of digital currencies that's going on as well. So a lot of money is actually front running political stuff, particularly on cryptocurrency markets. But you've also got this whole debate around, do banks start tokenizing all of their payments so that they don't have to use dollar anymore? All of this is bubbling underneath, and the markets are going, do you know what? That's just all too difficult. We're not going to worry about it. Let's just look at interest rates. And that's what's happening. So you've got this huge disconnect between understanding the reality and, all of us who like talking into an echo chamber, self included, go, this is ridiculous. What on earth is happening? Why aren't markets pricing in political risk? And it's because they can't price it. They don't know how to price it because everything is so uncertain at the moment that actually pricing of risk, whether you're right the way from insurance businesses, right the way through to you deciding on a dynamic pricing model, whether you're going to go with British Airways or whether you're going to go with, TUI flight for your holiday, everything, prices are not certain. And that's the nature of the economic war that we're in. Prices aren't certain, so risk can't be calculated. So what's the one certainty? Whether or not taxes are going up, whether or not the government's going to borrow any more, or whether or not the Fed's going to keep interest rates steady. And so you've just got complete disconnect. and people will still make money.
Interesting. And so for the next 6 months,
It'll
how
carry
do you
on like
see
that.
that? You think it will?
I mean, I think we are. So a couple of years ago, when Trump was being elected and when the government, Labour government, was first in power, I rather boldly, I think, said that I thought that everybody would carry on loving the US dollar, and markets would still continue rising. And there've been a couple of moments when I thought, oh, I wish I hadn't stuck my head above the parapet quite as loudly with that, but it's come back. And you look at what's happening with the dollar at the moment. I mean, it's not as strong as it was, but actually it's still strong enough. And so I'm having ridiculous conversations with people inside government about dollar hegemony, for example. Is the US dollar going to be the dominant currency for the next 10, 20, 30 years? And everybody goes, yeah, of course it is. But the fact of the matter is that money is changing. We've got more digital money, and the extent to which the dollar dominates in those markets is really questionable. And again, meanwhile, the markets go, well, we don't know how to deal with this. It's not in our guardrails. We don't know our guidelines. We don't know how to do this. So let's just look at interest rates because everything else is just so economists love holding things constant. Let's ignore everything else that's going on and just look at how much money we make given cost of borrowing, interest rates.
They revert to type until something
Yeah,
dramatic happens.
yeah.
Yeah.
And anybody who says, even Katie Martin in the Financial Times, she is, and you know, Armstrong, Rupert Rodder, I can't remember his first name, but Armstrong, who writes the Unhedged thing in the Financial Times as well. Both of them are now quite legitimately saying they don't know. I've been saying I don't know for a very long time because I've seen all of these patterns emerging. I think anybody who actually says they know what's going to happen in markets or they know what's going to happen with rates policy, they're not looking at the reality of the problems that are out there in the world. And we are, according to my military sources, very closer than anybody has ever seen us to. And you know, they're on public record for saying all of this, so I'm not disclosing anything, but they would not be surprised if we were at war within 18 months. So do you come out of this and say, well, actually the reason why markets are doing this is because we need a war to sort all of this out? She
That'd
said
be the
cheerfully.
shock.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
Move on.
Measuring comment.
Something as that. It's not the world's most cheerful thing to be saying, but you know, that is the military calculation at the moment, which is why they're pushing so much on getting defence and security fit for purpose.
We are, yeah. We haven't got any questions in yet. If anybody would like to ask a question again, please just use the Zoom function. I have plenty of other stuff I can ask Rebecca, so I don't feel that you need to ask anything. Next, Rebecca, I was interested in your views on tax policy in the UK and how it will develop from this point on. I guess by inference, you talked about really the Labour Party just trying to keep everybody happy and failing because it's a very difficult thing to do, particularly in a dislocated world. But what do you perceive? It's not too far until September. You know, we're going to get the sort of budget funny season or silly season again with rumours
Yeah,
left, right, and centre, depending
yeah.
on who's spreading them. What can you see coming?
So I think tax policy, whether or not it'll happen, but I think tax policy has to change. So I think that the issue around the budgets with, you know, non-doms and all of the things that have been done that have seen slightly punitive, very punitive for high net worth individuals that have taken money offshore, and then the sort of taxing of offshore accounts as well. You know, sort of you can run but you can't hide. That sort of almost panic reaction. I actually think the government can't do without individuals who are high net worth individuals, and they can't do without that additional support. So I think one of the things that might happen, and I know it's under discussion, so I mean, I'm giving a little bit of insider information, but again, it's in the public domain as well. I think what is like to happen is that the tax system will be rejigged to incentivize people to invest in critical national infrastructure. Now, whether that is war bonds, security bonds, whether or not it's money gets put into a huge state-run pension fund that uses the resources that are in the city, that then you as an individual are incentivized to invest in order to make it focused on building of British infrastructure. It's one of the ideas that's being floated at the moment. But I think the damage that the government has done by saying you're rich people and we don't like you because we're supporting this group of people who are vulnerable. You can do both. You don't need to offend the wealthy. The wealthy need to be, a lot of the wealthy people that you speak to have a real sense of patriotism and patriotic capital behind them, that they want to invest in the UK because, what I'm saying isn't extraordinary anymore. It might have been a couple of years ago, but it's not extraordinary anymore. And I think most people are looking out the window and going, what the hell is happening? I mean, I've got colleagues who've been in NATO and military and this, that, and the other, and they're in despair at how little resource there is for funding of military and defence and security and critical national infrastructure at the moment. And so that process of bringing people back is something that if I were the leader of the Labour Party, so I'm not going to say Keir Starmer or Andy Burnham or Wes Streeting, but if it when I'm in charge of the world, I will be a very benign dictator, and what I would do is bring back the people who've been alienated by taxation policy and say, look, we are in a national emergency. We've got to think of economic security first and economic growth second. But by the way, if we think of economic security, then the chances are that we're investing in the bottom base of the economy, and that creates growth anyway, good old traditional Labour values. But we're going to incentivize you to bring your money back by buying, let's call them security bonds rather than war bonds or defence bonds. But everybody says this is not something they want to do because they don't want to talk about war. But actually, we need to acknowledge the nature of the crisis that we're in. Then we can start having a different conversation about taxation. Then we can start having a different conversation about borrowing, and we can start looking at how it creates long-term economic growth. And I think that's the way to go. I think that's got to be the movement. Again, back to Gordon Brown's appointment, I think that's what he's steering from behind the scenes.
So a move, and I'll be brief on this because we have got some questions out, which we'll come on to in a second, but a move away perhaps from the redistribution type policies that we've seen so far and back more towards sort of centralist economic policy.
Yeah.
Okay. We've got questions. A lot of people have picked up on some of the stuff you said. The first question, who would the UK go to war with in the next 18 months and why?
So the UK will get dragged into a NATO campaign against Russia. And the reason why is because we are already in that campaign against Russia. There is already the cyber attacks, the sort of Russia has been Russia's an economic war. Russia treats economics and military war, fighting war, as the same thing. Russia has been in this space for a very long time. It's been undermining Europe. If you look at the rhetoric around all the things that are happening, and then look at the United States and it's withdrawing its commitment to Article 5 verbally, Russia will nurdle. And so while it might not be a full-scale war, you have to prepare for a full-scale war, and the biggest threat is on our borders. It's Russia at the moment. The UK will also be drawn into a security force in the Gulf if this peace treaty goes through. And that is not necessarily as benign as it sounds because it'll be secure, but you can bet your life that any agreement doesn't mean that Iran and the US and Israel and Lebanon and that whole region isn't still a tinderbox. So I think the need for increased military expenditure is absolutely there, but the biggest material threat that the government sees at the moment, let's just say, is Russia.
Um, if there is not a war, what else, in your opinion, could wrest the economic world order back to where we'd like it to be, back to reality, if you like? I
Um,
guess picking up
so
on what we were
so
talking about 20 minutes
yeah,
ago.
so there is no normal to return to first. And I think acknowledging that your economic security is the flip side of your defense and security. And that the economic elements of this, and you could talk about, and I have to be very, very careful because China is both an adversary and a strategic partner. So, it's a business partner, there are investment opportunities, there are all sorts of things, but there are also huge risks with trading with China as well in terms of dumping, in terms of ownership, in terms of security, data security, and so on. We all know about all of this. So there is an economic security threat from the fact that something very simple could happen. China suddenly says, well, actually, we're going to create we're going to limit the supply into the international markets of legacy semiconductors. I ran a model on this. It would take 3 months for communication systems to break down and break down
Yeah.
irrevocably. So those are the sorts of warfare threats that we aren't perhaps modeling into our thinking at the moment. So there's no normal to return to. So what do you need? You need to say, actually, economic security is really important. It's as big an existential threat as a kinetic threat, a military threat at the moment, a fighting war. So let's have a think about how we structure our institutions. And if I were the government at the moment, I'd be saying, okay, economic security acknowledged to be a threat, and I've just written a book called The World at Economic War, so I'm obviously biased on all of this, but I would say the government needs to think very seriously about joining dots across government departments around economic security and putting not economic growth but economic security at the heart of what it does.
A couple of other quick questions to finish. Well, Labour are clearly increased tax significantly in lots of areas. Were Labour to lose power, do you see the policy of moving pension wealth into the inheritance tax to be liable for inheritance tax from April next year being reversed?
No. Were Labour not in power, and this is the point that Keir Starmer is trying to make, he's just making it in a very sort of reasonable kind of a way, an
Mm,
analytical kind of a way. But the point is that this economy, in the famous, infamous words of Liam Byrne all those years ago, there's no money left. They cannot. This is why the Labour government kept to the fiscal constraints that were already there. It's why it's been so difficult raising money. There from markets, because ultimately we are already, I mean, our debt's 94% of GDP, which doesn't sound high in comparison to China and the United States, but markets know about the structural problems underneath. And so they read the same newspapers as everybody else does and get the information that everybody else does. So they know that there's a weakness there. They're looking for leadership. Markets are looking for leadership on this as much as the population is. But unless there is a coordinated approach to this, and unless we keep money revenue generation as it is, there's no money coming from anywhere else at the moment. So
um,
something has to change, basically.
okay.
But it won't be
Uh,
bringing taxes down or borrowing down.
Reversing unpopular, yeah. One question to finish, because as I said, we'll finish just after 5 to 10, 5 to 11. I mean, last year in the summertime, it looked for a long time as if Labour were going to renege on their promise not to increase income tax, which they made in the manifesto. Then they reversed out of that, seemingly, I think, from memory, only 9 or 10 days before the budget. Um, does that come back on? If there's no money left, that has to come back to be back on the cards again, I guess. Does it this year, this September, October?
It comes back on the cards every single time there's a budget, because everybody says the most efficient way of raising
Mm.
money is through income tax. And you talk to people and everybody says, do you know what, if I was charged a penny more on my income tax, I'd grumble a bit about it, but I'd put up and shut up because I knew there was a bigger picture out there. In order to do that, though, if the government is going to break a promise, then it's going to have to explain why. And this is the problem of communications back to the very beginning. The government has not explained why it's in such a mess with the public finances. And I think the British public knows. I think the British public understands. I think individuals understand. They just want the government to say, do you know what? This, we're not going to be political about it. We're not going to blame the Tories or ourselves or anybody. This is the material fact of where we are, and this is how we're going to deal with it. And we are going to borrow more, and we are going to put taxes up by 1%. But some of that borrowing is going to be put into long-term investment rather than appearing on the balance sheet. So we're going to correct it. And maybe I'm very idealistic, but I would think that that's got to be the way the government goes. And again, back to Gordon Brown point, I think he would be prepared to have that conversation with Rachel Reeves if she's still in post.
Regrettably, we have to stop now. I'm sure you've got lots of things to get on to. We've had some lovely feedback actually live. Someone's just written, "This is absolutely superb, very unsettling but fascinating," and I completely agree with that. They're clearly talking about you and not me.
Well, I'm
Um,
unsettling.
Unsettling in what you're saying, but incredibly informed. Thank you so much for lending us your time this morning. It's been really interesting to hear your views. We might well try and do a little bit more, perhaps, but I'll talk to you about that offline, maybe later in the week.
Thank you
To
very
everybody
much.
that's dialed in, thank you very much indeed for taking the time to do so. I hope you found this to be interesting. And we will, as I say, try and offer more content along these lines in the not too distant future. But otherwise, Rebecca, again, on behalf of Foresight, thank you very much indeed for taking the time. And I'll cut the webinar off now. But thank you.
Thank you. Take care. Bye.
Bye bye.